All righty, I want to welcome everybody to our second talk in our seminar series on extremism, targeted violence, and terrorism in the United States and abroad. Today, we're lucky to have Dr. Shannon Houck come speak to us about QAnon. Dr. Houck is coming from us from the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Prior to joining MPS, she was a faculty member at Syracuse University from 2016 to 2020. She earned her PhD in social psychology from the University of Montana. Currently, her research focuses on the causes and consequences of rigid versus flexible thinking as they pertain to the dynamics of peace, conflict, influence, and political ideology. She's the author of over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and her research has been featured on news outlets like the New York Times, Psychology Today, and USA Today. Her publications and more information can be found at her wonderful webpage, www.shannonhouck.com. So I highly encourage everybody to check that out. And additionally, as part of this seminar series, I want to actually encourage everybody to reach out to our speakers, whether you're another researcher or you're coming from DHS, DOJ, or a government or industrial partner in the Homeland Security enterprise. So with that, I'm going to deal with one or two notes before we transition over. So Dr. Houck has indicated that she is welcome to get sort of little hand raises during her talk. So if you have a question, what I'm going to request that you do is raise your hand on the chat feature, and I'll try to pay attention to that. And if I recognize who you are, then I'll probably just let you unmute and do your interruption and ask your question during the talk. But if I'm not sure who you are, please don't get offended. I just ask that you write a brief little summary of the question, like I want to ask about blah. That way we can just sort of monitor the question and make sure we don't get any unfortunate Zoom bombing going on. With that, I want to say thank you to DHS for supporting this seminar series. But of course, with that, the views, statements, conclusions contained in this presentation are not those of and should not be interpreted as the views or policies of the Department of Homeland Security, much less NCITE or the University of Central Florida. I think we all speak as individuals in this case. All right, so with that, again, if you have a question, feel free to just raise your hand and give me a little summary in the chat, and we'll sort of unmute you so that you can ask Dr. Houck. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to her, and she'll take over and go from there. Thank you, Dr. Houck. Please proceed.
Awesome. No, thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to speak with you all today. So I'm excited to be here. And I also have to give my obligatory statement that says, you know, nothing I say today is reflective of the official position of the Naval Postgraduate School of the Navy, any DoD entity, and I'm not authorized to give official positions on behalf of those entities. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm going to actually share my screen here with you. Okay, just a quick thumbs up if sound and you can see that okay? Perfect, okay. So, and just to reinforce this idea of, I hope this can be more, you know, as much as Zoom kind of allows this to be conversational, please pipe in with a question, interrupt me with comments. I'd love for that. This work that I'm going to be talking about today is very much in the early stages. It's very much in progress. And I opted to do that you know, because the published work that I have out there, you can already read, and I wanted to kind of present things that I'm working on right now, and in the hopes of getting some feedback on how to move it forward as I continue on with this research. And the focus is on QAnon today, and you know, I know most of us in this room have heard of QAnon, especially after the attacks on the Capitol, where we saw a lot of you know, Q symbols and Q, you know, followers that were there, a lot of imagery, and then a lot of news reporting, even more so on QAnon afterwards. For example, Jacob Chansley, the guy who was wearing the horns and his picture has been circulated just about everywhere, goes by QAnon Shaman, a leader of whatever you want to call this. We're going to talk about what to call it, whether it's a movement, a conspiracy theory. It's really hard to kind of define this in a simple way. Ashley Babbitt, who tried to, climb into a broken window, was shot and killed. She posted a lot of QAnon conspiracy theories on her social media pages and was reported to be deep into QAnon. So this is being talked about a lot. It's been talked about in different ways, and it's clear that it's having some real world impacts. And for all of that conversation, and probably because it's just a little bit early on in understanding QAnon, there's a lack of empirical research on this topic. And so my hope is to kind of contribute to that conversation today just a little bit. So overview of the talk, I want to provide a backstory kind of framework on QAnon, what it is, how we talk about it, before actually getting to the data that I want to present, which involves looking at Q messaging over time. Okay, so what is Q saying? What are the themes, the content themes, and why might that matter? And not just what is being said, but how is it being said? So sort of this idea of the underlying structure of language and what that can predict. And in this case, I'm specifically focusing on the structure of language as it relates to violence. So a lot of what we say, is a reflection of what we think and can predict behavior. So that's my focus for today. So before we actually get to the data, some backstory here to kind of ground the conversation. QAnon's been called lots of different things. Conspiracy theory doesn't do it justice because it's really a compilation of many conspiracy theories. It's fairly clear at this point that there's elements of extremism involved. And that in 2019, the FBI signaled that it was a domestic terror threat in an internal memo, really for its propensity to inspire violence. So it's probably all of these things together and others, but I want to give you some of the core beliefs. And that really is that there's a deep state of corrupt elites. So primarily Democrats and people in Hollywood that control the country and really control the world, and that many of them, worship Satan and are engaging in ritualistic torture of children. And there's a lot of themes of pedophilia in these beliefs. This kind of all started in 2017 when a user named Q started posting these cryptic messages on the fringe internet sites. It was 4chan, and now it's switched over to the 8chan, and I believe now it's 8kun. And Q has since gone dark after the election. But Q claimed to be an insider, working on the inside of the government, and began leaking secret, what Q claimed was secret intelligence about the institutionalized crime that's going on by these corrupt elites. And I'll refer to these Q messages on this message board as drops. Okay, that's what they're referred to. And these are just messages that have been put out. In case you're curious, Q, so that he claims to have, or they claim to have, security clearance, high-level security clearance, and all of this insider information. Q is actually a clearance in the Department of Energy, as I understand it. Obviously, this is all baseless, so I should just say that up front. Another kind of core belief is that Mr. Trump, members of the US military, and select leaders are going to guide the world to a better future and bring this underground group of corrupt elites to justice. So I would say these are kind of the central beliefs here, but then there are beliefs kind of on the periphery of that and get a little bit more, how shall I say it, a little bit more unique, a little bit more outside of the realm of what we would consider in normal belief. So a qualitative analysis was recently done by a separate research group looking at the narratives that emerged in QAnon followers during the COVID pandemic specifically. So this is looking at just a slice of time here. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that QAnon is talking about and the nature of kind of the extremism involved here, 4 key narratives came up. So Spygate, this idea that the Obama administration planted a spy into the Trump campaign in 2016 to help Hillary Clinton win. Pizzagate is real is another kind of theme that continues to come up. I'm not saying Pizzagate is real. I'm saying that's what QAnon or many QAnon followers would say. For those of you who have not heard of Pizzagate, this refers to this pizza parlor in DC, Comet Ping Pong, and the claim is that there's this underground, or there's in the basement is where some of this underground sex trafficking ring is occurring among Democratic elites and Hollywood, that they're sex trafficking children out of the basement of this pizzeria. It actually does not have a basement, but that part doesn't matter so much. Adrenochrome is this belief that these elites are harvesting this chemical called adrenochrome out of children's blood and using it to stay young and healthy. This was quickly linked to a cure for COVID. So on that note, lots of COVID disinformation, anywhere from, COVID is completely made up, a fake narrative, to the vaccine's going to implant chips in us so the government can track us. So what I don't mean to say is that everybody who has engaged with Q content or posted something or liked something, or even maybe believes a part of this, doesn't necessarily believe all of these things. So it's quite complicated in that sense. And I would just refer you back to kind of the core beliefs of QAnon and really revolve around this deep state. Fancy little image there. Lizard. Okay, so this reminds me to talk about, because we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about an act of violence, but there are some relationships between QAnon followers and the belief that there are lizard people. And that is literally just what it sounds like, that there are lizards among us disguised as humans that will eventually take over the world. Okay, so these are kind of the things that QAnon is saying. And you might take a step back and react by saying, well, okay, why do we care? If people think these things, fine, it's not my deal, but why should it actually matter? And I want to give you a list of reasons why I think it does matter. So first of all, I think this is very representative of the kinds of extremism that we're seeing within the US today. So I'm not talking about QAnon specifically because I think QAnon is necessarily the thing we have to focus on and like the root of the problem, but rather representative of a much larger problem of domestic extremism in the United States today. So I'll just pull this quote here. It says from the FBI director directly here, we assess the greatest threat to the homeland is not one organization, certainly not one ideology, but rather lone actors, largely self-radicalized online who pursue soft targets using readily accessible weapons. And I think QAnon, and specifically when I talk about some of the acts of violence carried out by some QAnon followers, I think this really maps on here to what we're talking about in terms of domestic extremism. Okay, so obviously they're connected with violence. It's become a part of kind of the political discourse. This is something that's not going away. And it's something that's affecting real, like actual people, actual families, and actual relationships. So there was some polling data recently about 350 people. 7% claimed that they had favorable views towards QAnon and believed that it gave accurate information. And of that 7%, about half said that those beliefs really negatively impacted their relationships with family and friends. So this is affecting real people. Now, I want to give you, and I'm going to get to the data, I promise here, but I want to give you a kind of a snapshot of how QAnon has evolved over time. First of all, we don't know actually who Q is, or if they're multiple people. But when I say Q, I'm talking about this anonymous user that's posting these messages, these drops. And that first drop happened in October of 2017. Okay, so here's kind of some salient events that have been talked about here, and some a kind of a snapshot over time. You've seen Congresswoman Taylor in the media quite a bit. I think it's actually just, so I'm going to pull up, or I put up here the two things that She said in 2017, Q's a patriot. This second thing kind of represents a typical, it fits in with the narrative of QAnon, kind of that core belief that she says there's a once in a lifetime opportunity to take this global cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles out. And I think we have the president to do it. Now, I'm not putting that up here to condemn any one person, but rather to say, like, this has become a part of mainstream politics, or at least the conversation about it. Now, she has since denounced those things and said, as you've heard in the media, that was, a while ago, and that once she realized that Q was disinformation, has stopped following that. So nevertheless, it's been 27 candidates on the general election ballot had engaged with Q content, whether that's through likes, shares, or even verbal expressions of agreement at some point. So it would be remiss not to mention that as of 2019, Q hashtags were appearing more often than some of the other major movements like Me Too and climate change, to the point where now estimates are, there's thousands of Facebook, or at least there was before, a lot of them have been removed, but Facebook pages and followers. It's really difficult to say the number of QAnon followers, but this gives you a broad sense of this is becoming increasingly relevant over time, and is really sort of taken off. How does that happen though? How do you go from sitting at your computer at home and, going from not necessarily buying into any of these things to believing some of the things that I discussed earlier? How does that actually happen? And I think it's useful to look to some previous research and theory, and I'm coming at this from a perspective of social psychology here. So I think, first of all, there's just, as human beings, there's an inherent motivation to make meaning out of the world, to make sense out of things, especially when things are chaotic. Our brains don't necessarily like it when things are chaotic. We want to put narratives to things. We seek patterns even when they don't exist. This is a natural part of our human brains. And so I think that is important to mention, especially because, it's pretty clear that, especially in the last year or so, it's been fairly chaotic. And during COVID, by the way, you saw 174% increase in engagement with QAnon content. So this idea that it's chaotic and people want to make sense of that, what the heck is going on? On top of that, you're sitting at your computer, and this has been talked about elsewhere here. We have these social media algorithms that just reinforce what you're actually seeing and engaging with online. So you might see a friend post something that's, you don't start with, I just believe in lizard people, right? It starts small, and maybe you see something like, well, there really is a problem with sex trafficking. I don't like sex trafficking. No one likes that. So you click on that, and then it kind of puts you down the rabbit hole and becomes more extreme over time. And with that becomes more isolation. I would also say, from a purely psychology of influence perspective, there are a lot of things with the QAnon sort of group of people, and Q, if you look at the drops specifically, it promotes free thinking. And that's really attractive to people. It's not saying you need to believe this, because I'm saying so, and this is absolutely right. It's not like that. It's saying things like, do your own research. You'll see that theme come up a lot. Do the research, look it up. It'll post links to go, find different things. And the idea is that people are coming to these conclusions on their own. And so there's this promotion there of free thinking, and don't take things at face value. That's attractive for people. When you also look at principles of psychological influence in terms of emotional messaging, some of the data I'm going to show revolve around the emotion in Q messages. And so fear and emotion can be quite persuasive. And we also know, when it comes to being in a social media environment, that negative content, tends to spread much farther, much faster than it does positive content. So I think all of these things provide a way to kind of inform how this happens in the first place, not just with QAnon, but with other extremist movements that are operating right now in a modern information environment. So here's, finally, we're getting to the data here. Here's what I want to present to you as my first set of analyses. I was thinking through some of this backstory research about isolation, about promoting free thinking, about emotional messaging, and how we know those things tend to be influential. And what I was interested in is, to what degree are those cue drops actually using these psychological principles of influence? And if we can kind of understand, patterns of language that are going on, maybe it has some sort of predictive value, or at least provides a framework for understanding how people might be influenced, or at least gives a tiny slice of one way in which people might be influenced. Because ultimately, people are reading messages in front of their computer, and those messages are doing something to them, right? It's changing thinking, and in some cases, changes behavior. So for the first set of analyses, in terms of expectations, so I'm looking at the cue messages over time, and I didn't have specific expectations about emotion necessarily, although I thought there would be just more emotional messaging over time, but not specific emotions. I didn't have any a priori hypotheses about that. But I did think that based on this idea that people get more isolated over time, they tend to feel in conflict with family and friends, I thought you'd see a decrease in social language over time. So to test those expectations, I actually was able to, this is not my data file originally, I was able to get a data file from a Swedish company, Authorship Analysis, and they were very kind to share their baseline data file. And from that, which included the 4,952 cue drops, from the very first one until November 13th, 2020. I went through and I removed a bunch of blank messages. A lot of nonsense text was in there. It was just a link to a website. All of that has to get removed because the scoring systems, the text analysis programs, are just, wanting to assess the actual language and not those nonsense syllables. So that resulted in a final data set of still 4,087 of these cue drops. And in the first set of analysis that I did, I used the linguistic inquiry word count. And a lot of students and faculty in this room have probably heard of this program, but it's a text analysis program that quantifies language. And it does so by calculating the percentage of words associated with various psychological categories, over 80 of them. The ones that I was focused on are emotional language, cognitive processes, and social language. But there's a whole, again, there's 80 of these different categories. There's moral language. It looks at all of the punctuation, lots that is built into this excellent text analysis program. And here are the results here. So for emotional language specifically, and what I'm doing is I'm looking at the cue drops over time and analyzing it not by month or year, but by actual cue drop. Okay, so you don't see an effect, a statistically significant effect for positive or negative emotion. What you do see is more language that contains anxiety. So words would be, nervous, worried, tense. You see more of those anxiety-related words over time. You see significantly more anger over time, looking at those cue drops, and you see significantly less sadness. Now, thinking about this after, looking at these results, I think, it makes sense that that anger and anxiety increase over time. And in the sense of, anger is an emotion that facilitates action, whereas sadness is something that kind of hampers action. I think that pattern of results makes sense when you're looking at kind of this movement, this influential conspiracy beliefs that have, kind of taken off over time. For cognitive processes, you see significantly more insight over time. And this is consistent, again, with that idea that cue, when you look at the posts, is saying things like, think for yourself, don't take this at face value, do your own research. So that's pretty consistent, but maybe not what people might expect from an extremist, an extremist group or extremist person, right? So you tend to think of rigidity. And I'm actually going to talk about that next in the second set of analyses, because I think this is a complicated picture here. Significantly more tentative language, and no effects for the other three within this category. And then the last one. So I talked about looking at social processes specifically, and this idea of trying to test out, is cue really influencing isolation over time? And you do see a significant negative association between over time with social language. And I don't want to make too much of this because there's no significant effects that emerge specifically for family or friends. So overall pattern, summary results, you see more, no effect for just general positive or negative emotion, but you see less sadness over time, more anxiety, more anger. For social language, you see, an overall effect of less social language over time, effects not significant for family or friends. This is the first set of analysis looking at the specifically the content of cues posts over time and how that might map on to some of the things that we know about the psychology of influence. Before I shift to the second set of analyses that I want to present, let me pause there and see if anyone wants to jump in with either questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going. I see a hand raised by Aaron.
All right, I'm unmuted. Very fascinating work. One thing that just kind of comes to mind, and this, so we're now in new territory, but when I was a grad student, we were applying these methods, to analyze jihadism. And one of the things that we found, and similar, not me, 4chan and 8chan weren't so popular then, it was these hidden forums, was authorship analysis was critical. Because some of the things that might be muddling the results that you were expecting could be the noise from just different authors. And I wonder if you can constrain that variance a bit by doing some sort of authorship analysis and sort of segmenting them into, buckets.
No, it's a fantastic point. And so to be clear, I'm specifically, what I want to do next is look at cue followers. And this is specifically from the same source, from those cue drops directly, all 4,000 of them. So it's not, so Orf Analytics did a study that suggested there's at least 2 different people that are cue. So maybe there's 2 different authors here. I think it's unknown, but these results are specifically looking at that. But I think to follow up on that point, and it's this idea of how do you constrain variability, not only for authorship, but there's really quite a lot of variability that exists here. And so I think it's important, one, not to overstate the findings, but 2, another one that I want to point out, and I'd love to get thoughts on this, but, it's to what degree I'm trying to make this kind of broad relationship between these are the language themes that emerge, and they've emerged increasingly so as followership essentially has increased, or this has gained traction. That arrow, there's a lot that could happen in between, right? So is it actually this language that's the thing that's influential? This is all operating within a context that's very complex. There's lots that is going on. Additionally to that it's hard to say, is the language about, let's just take social language, for example. This text analysis system and most language systems don't say, what specifically they're talking about. So it could be the case that they're saying, something positive about social language. Like, it's actually hard to really figure out what those language themes mean. Is there an implication? Let me just go back here for a second, because it helps me to look at the patterns here. But it's very hard to say, like, what is this increasing anger about? Maybe it's at, like, the target could possibly matter. So you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to emphasize the point that I think this variability is very tricky, not only for authorship, but really for a whole host of things. And I think it's difficult to control. So Aaron, please jump in and interrupt my rambly answer
great.
to the
I
question.
don't mind if I do. No, I mean, because it's so interesting, but I'll constrain myself. No, and the other thing is time. Time is a factor here. Sounds critical. If you added time, I bet you might find some significance just because you would reduce the error, the things that are being assigned to error. So it could be interesting, but yeah, you have a lot of things. This is such an interesting data set.
When I'm happy to share the data set too, I think it's important to get a bunch of minds to look at this and to parse it in different ways. I don't see everybody on my screen, so please, if there are other questions, I see Victor.
We have another question from Victor.
So first of all, Shannon, this is really fascinating. Still depressing, but really fascinating. Thank you. Have you tied this yet into actions in terms of violence or other kinds of actions?
So you couldn't have queued me up better for my second set of analyses. That's where I'm headed next. I just am taking a long time to get there. So maybe we just jump in to that.
Because what I've seen so far is extraordinarily interesting. From somebody who's interested in behavior, my hunch is that you're going to tell us something really interesting in terms of behavior next, if that's where we're going. And clearly from the next PowerPoint it is. So I'll shut up and ask you more questions later.
No, that's good. I appreciate it. Perfect segue. And I'm shifting from talking about content of the messages, of cues messages, to the underlying structure of messages. And to do that, I'm focusing on a language variable that's been used a lot in political psychology, and I think increasingly used, I think that's fair to say, and that's integrative complexity. For those of you who haven't heard of integrative complexity, and I imagine many of you have not, it's essentially, in basic terms, it's a measurement designed to capture the degree to which people are communicating in black and white terms, more rigidly, versus more flexibly and open. There's kind of two key elements to that. The first is differentiation. Okay, do people recognize that there's different points of view on a topic? And the second is integration. Do they combine those things, synthesize them in some sort of meaningful way? And I think it's important and useful to just give an example from a non-political, non-controversial topic, and that's coffee, because surely everybody can get on board for coffee, especially on this Friday afternoon here. So I just want to give you a sense of what the scale is. 1 to 7 scale. 1 would be a very simple statement, no differentiation or recognition of different viewpoints, no combining of those viewpoints. So this would be something like, coffee's amazing in every way. There's no question about it. It's the best. Okay, very rigid, one-dimensional statement. Slightly more complex than that, you would say something like, coffee tastes great. Okay, so you're pointing out one perspective, but it affects the quality of my sleep. It's a completely separate dimension on which you're evaluating this topic of coffee. Even more complex, differentiation. So recognizing that it tastes great, and that's different from what it does to my sleep. So those are the two different dimensions here in this example. But then here would be integration. So there's a trade-off, saying that I have to weigh those pros and cons and decide if on balance it's worth it to drink my coffee. This is really just designed to kind of give you a sense of what integrative complexity is and what it does. And so it takes any communication, spoken or written, and scores it for integrative complexity from a 1 to 7 scale, 1 being most simplistic, 7 most complex. And why I'm focusing on this is because there's quite a long history of research that suggests an association between simplicity, integrative simplicity, so more rigid language, and violence, and specifically that drops in integrative complexity are associated with violent and aggressive outcomes. So what I wanted to do is see, is there a way that we can map that idea onto this issue of QAnon specifically, and looking at some of the aggressive or violent actions that QAnon followers have carried out over this time. And so I expected that you might see the same sort of thing, that when you look at the cues messages, you'd see a drop in complexity immediately preceding an aggressive action. I didn't know, so there hasn't been any research to my knowledge of looking at integrative complexity patterns sort of pre and post aggressive or violent action. So the data that I'm going to present to you there are quite exploratory. And I would also say that approach this with a skeptical and cautious mind. I'm going to talk about limitations at the end here, but also understand that this is preliminary work here. And I think a lot more needs to be done. Same data file. I use the automated integrative complexity system. So it used to be that I remember as an undergrad, I would score like all of this text by hand, and you don't have to do that anymore. There's a computer that does this for you, which is great. And what I was interested in looking at complexity and proximity to different violent acts. I looked at this in a couple different ways analytically. And students, and faculty, you'll have suggestions of how I can do this better and maybe with more sophisticated statistical methods. So please jump in and say that. But what I simply did is I took categories in time before violence. I grouped it in days, weeks, and months. Part of that is subject to just the data that were available. So these timeframes are not perfect and they just can't be. You only have what you have. I also looked at it used a continuous measurement of proximity to a violent event in days. And so what I tried to do is select cases of violent action across time from 2018 to 2020. And in the interest of time, because I know we're getting short on time and I'd love to have questions, just a brief snapshot here. I'm going to pull them all up at once. So this is very difficult. So it's difficult to say what is Q inspiring in terms of violence. And I think that's difficult when you talk about inspired violence in general. So the cases that I'm selecting here are cases that have been reported to be carried out by followers of QAnon. What's difficult about this is, especially for some of these cases, there's an overlap, right? So some people both believe in QAnon and other conspiracy theories, or there might be other things contributing. So I'm not saying that I've isolated like, hey, this is the golden thing here, but maybe it provides one slice to inform how we can think about this in terms of predicting behavior. Maybe I'm cautious about it. So a lot of these have been reported here. So Hoover Dam Incident, a guy takes an armored truck, fills with a bunch of ammo and weapons, blocks the Hoover Dam for I don't know, I think it was hours or something like that. I believe, and you might be able to tell me this, but I believe he was convicted or pled guilty to terrorism, I believe. There in January 6th, so moving forward in time, January 6th, a Seattle man murdered his brother by stabbing him in the head with a sword because he thought he was a lizard. He had posted a lot of QAnon related conspiracy content. An arson that occurred at Comment Pizza, the same one that I talked about earlier, that's implicated by QAnon followers to be involved in this sex trafficking ring. More recently, a man in Massachusetts had his 5 kids in the car and took police on like a 20-mile chase. Meanwhile, he was live streaming the whole incident and espousing QAnon beliefs. He even said like, Q, save me. I don't have data on the Capitol, the Capitol riot because Q stopped posting. So I put that there just to anchor this timeline a little bit. Okay, here's what we see. So I'm starting with the most recent, that car chase that I just first mentioned, looking at the communication style before. Leading up to the car chase, you see a significant increase in the days before this car chase. So what you do see right after that is a significant decrease on the day of the actual car chase. And you see it kind of gradually is gonna increase again after that. To anchor this, by the way, up in the corner here, I have their overall IC for this particular year, so in 2020. Most people's integrative complexity, by the way, is quite low. It turns out we're not very complex people in the way that we communicate, and people associated with violence even less complex. So this is the broader pattern. Second one, I'll just pull them all up here because I do want to be sure we have time, and I know we're running out here. Same sort of pattern here. So you have an increase in integrative complexity leading up to the event. Okay, and not all of these are significant. So 2 weeks to 1 month before the murder is significantly different from the day before the lizard murder. Okay, but not significantly different from 2 days to 2 weeks before. Okay, so my point is not to get hung up on all of these planned comparisons, though I'm happy to talk about them, but rather to try to give you an overall descriptive pattern, which also is inferentially supported here. Same thing, decrease in complexity on the day of the murder, significant decrease, and then it goes way up right after that. I'll present the final two here. So same sort of general pattern. This is the difficulty about this Pizzagate arson data is that there's actually no Q drop on the day of, and really not in a good. This arson happened on January 23rd. Okay, there was a huge gap in when Q posted between January 13th and February 1st. And so it's difficult to say, would you have seen, a decrease in complexity in very close proximity to this arson? It's hard to say, those data just don't exist. But you do see, at least leading up to this event, you do see an increase in complexity. And then the same sort of pattern here when you go back to this is now in 2018, to that Hoover Dam blockade incident. And again, so these increases and decreases aren't happening at exactly the same time. I think it's what I'm trying to get at is the overall pattern here. So you see an increase in complexity immediately before, and then a decrease in complexity after. So broad picture, the messaging style particularly, not the content, prior to violent action shows an increase in integrative complexity, okay? Whether it's in a few days or a week or two before, there's an increase, but then kind of this sudden drop either the day before or on the day of the incident. It's difficult to know what to make of that, but it's consistent with some of the previous theories that suggest a lot of cognitive energy goes into planning an attack. So that would suggest, this increase in cognitive complexity of getting all these cognitive resources invested in the planning phases. And then, when a person kind of resolves themselves to action, you see this more rigid black and white outlook. So I'm no longer considering different options or planning. I'm like hardline focused in, and perhaps that's reflective of that drop on the day of the incident. Some very obvious limitations that I'm only going to highlight a few of them. I've only presented you 4 cases. This just takes a lot of time, and this is me doing this on my computer on my own. So I need to do more work at looking at more cases. There's not that many, though, even if you were to get all of them, there's not that many out there, but there are certainly others that I could look at. And I think that the data limitations in terms of not having the data necessarily on the day of an incident or right close up to it, at least in some cases, makes it difficult. But I want to try to look at overall patterns here. And then I think this is the most critical question, and it's just hard to know sometimes what to make of what people say and how that connects with what people do. And I know a lot of researchers tend to, feel great about that connection. And me, I give it a little pause and say, well, okay, can we really infer that it's this messaging that's inspiring violence? Or better said, what are some ways that we can increase our confidence that this is really language of influence that might be leading towards violence? How can we increase our confidence? And I don't know that I'm sold there yet, even though I'm presenting these data. I think that there's a lot more that we have to figure out how to account for. What I would like to do next, and what we've been talking about with colleagues here, is looking at the broad relationships between the Q drops, which is all that I focused on right now, and actually trying to answer or address that limitation by looking at how Q communicates in relation to then what Q followers are saying, and how can you kind of look at those relationships, and then can you use that, potential corresponding relationships to look at violent behavior or other aggressive action. So that's kind of the near-term focus and going forward. What I'd like to do, and I think we have about 10 minutes or so left, and I certainly have time. I'd like to ask for any other questions, comments. Yeah.
All right. So again, what I'm going to ask, first, I want to thank you, Dr. Houck, for mind-blowing presentation. I think my jaw's dropping every single time. So if you could just, everybody, if you have a question, just raise your hand. But if you could just give me the topic of the question real fast, and then we'll go from there. So the first question that we're going to have is from Nika. So I'm going to find Nika and ask to unmute you. And so Nika, go ahead and ask your question. Nika, are you there? Okay, so you should have an option to unmute. So I'm asking. Let's see. Okay, well, I'm gonna go back. I have Nika's question here. Her question revolved around the emotional lexicons that you used, the Amolex, or I guess the question is, did you use the Amolex or a BERT model?
I don't know what either of those words mean. So no, I didn't. I would like to learn more if you can send them to me, but no, for looking at the emotional content, I specifically used the Linguistic Inquiry Word Count by Jamie Pennebaker at University of Texas. And it's taking words associated with emotional language.
All right, our next question will be from Katie. So Katie, I'm going to unmute you now. Let's see. There we go.
Hi, thank you. It was very informative. My question is really regarding the Q adjacent messaging, especially as Q has stopped the drops right now. If you're seeing or have any plans to analyze that Q adjacent or other groups that are sort of in the, I guess, the recruitment phase of getting those QAnon followers over to their messaging, I guess what plans you might have for looking at that and determining if that's the methods and the outcomes are similar with those groups as well.
It's absolutely fantastic question. And yeah, you're reading my mind. I think, again, QAnon is one representation of a much larger issue. And so I think looking at, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, I mean, there's too many of them to name at this point. Antifa, this is not about, I think it's important to look at, across the spectrum extremism. And so, yes, that is the plan. I think, it's just a matter of as everything in research of time, right? So that is a focus, and that's a focus of some of our faculty here at Naval Postgraduate School in Defense Analysis. We have people that specialize in social network analysis and among other things. And so there's definitely my own interest and a broader interest in trying to figure out, is this a pattern that replicates across extremist groups? And then I didn't read your full comment in the chat here. I don't have it up, but you mentioned something on dissonance as I understand it. And I think in addition to looking at other groups, what I think is interesting and is another future direction is to look at all of these failed predictions that have happened and look at what does communication look like before and after those. Because I mean, it goes back to that whole Fessinger study of, you see some people resolving themselves and kind of digging in even deeper after these failed prophecies. And then you see other people maybe shifting gears and picking up with these other groups. And I'd like to look at patterns in proximity to those specific failed predictions.
Next, we're going to head over to Cynthia. Let's see, Cynthia, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello. Yeah, I can. So from your work, you were specifically looking for the Q comments, like the user's Q. Can you notice like something specific about the words that it's used and how those comments can influence others to be part of the QAnon? I know that some sort of the huge comment that you said that they say, oh, look for yourself or something like that. There is some emotion behind that, or other comments or words, specific words that you can see that kind of influence others to become more part of QAnon?
Thanks, Cynthia. No, it's an excellent question. And what I'd say now is that I haven't systematically assessed that yet, and that is a next direction. So all I've done at this point, at this early stage, is to take the Q drops, but not how they correspond to what people say right after that. And that's the bridge I want to make, because I want to know, like, what specifically in terms of these language themes might be having an influence, and can we look at that quantitatively or even qualitatively to see what happens after, you know, more messages related to, you know, do your own research, for example. That's a key thing that comes up. What do Q followers do immediately after that, right? We know what they do online, right? So there tends to be this engagement with, you know, trying to go to the sites, right, that usually are dropped right after that comment and try to, you know, read more about it. But what happens to the communication and to the behavior specifically? That's a question I don't have an empirical answer to.
All right, next up, we have a question from Shayla.
Yeah, hi. I was just volunteering an explanation for your findings.
Oh, good. I would like that. Yeah.
No, so mine was the dissonance comment, that maybe the reason that you had a different effect for Pizzagate was that there was ground truth associated with that event, whereas there wasn't, I mean, they weren't invading or doing something for the purpose of confirming a belief with the other three events that you studied. Right. So, I mean, there was no need to rationalize after the fact with the other three events. But with Pizzagate, it was like, OK, we went in thinking that there was this pedophile ring and there were going to be kids in the basement, and all of that came to naught. So now we still have to ramp up our rhetoric so that we don't lose credibility. So there's that post hoc justification that still needed to be in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's unlike the other cases. No, I think that's a good point, and I hadn't thought about it in that way. Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Very cool work. Thank you.
Victor?
So Shannon, first of all, congratulations. I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed your talk. I will note that I'm also doing research on domestic extremists, so I find this really fascinating. My key question or suggestion in terms of where you are at the project right now is, have you started to think about multivariate analysis, where you can bring in other variables to control to see, once you have those other variables, is this language that you're coding, is it still having a statistically significant and important effect? My hunch is the answer is yes. But I think any article, well, no, Shannon, I really do think the answer is yes. But I think that any article that you write, if you control for those multivariate factors, you're going to get a lot more traction than if you just look at it in a bivariate fashion.
Absolutely couldn't agree more. Yes is the short answer to that, and that suggestion well taken. That's where this is headed next. I think. You know, I think even before expanding to look at other groups, or before getting too, you know, caught up in my next idea of looking at kind of pre and post these failed predictions. I mean, I want to do all of that, but I do think that is really one of the most fundamental things, to be able to say, you know, these things, this language is corresponding to violence over and above. I don't know what do you think would be some of the key things? I can think of so many other things that might be important to account for, but maybe you have some better. Yeah, go ahead, tell me.
Oh, let's see. You can.
Basically, Aiden controls my world, and he doesn't unmute me. There's nothing I can do. So Shannon, I don't know if you're familiar with the Minorities at Risk organizational behavior data set, So it's a data set of violent and nonviolent organizations in the Middle East. And we have done a little bit of work with the similar kinds of variables in the United States back several years ago. And we just got a grant to collect data on extremist organizations, both nonviolent and violent. And I think the variables you would probably want to use are very similar to the variables that we'll be starting to collect. But if you send me an email, I'd be more than happy to send you several of the papers that we've done. Say, Victor, send me your Middle East MARAB stuff, but send me anything you've got in America. But I think, the issues here, one of the key differentials between what you're doing and what we're looking at is we're looking across a whole bunch of organizations, and you're focusing mostly on one organization. And I think to start with, getting data on that one organization. But Shannon, if you can get a grant, and I would certainly think that DHS should be funding, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that offline, is to get a grant that would allow you to look at this across 50 or 60 organizations. I think you're going to get a lot more traction. And then what you would do is you would code things like organizational size, or you could use data that already exists, like the ones we're collecting now, stuff like organizational size, organizational ideology, which would vary by organization, and several other organizational factors like leadership structure and such. And I think the key factor here is if you can control for those factors and you're still seeing the power of language and death, killing, I think that you got a lot of traction and there's an enormous potential. And as I said, I'd be more than happy to talk to you more about this offline. And since I'm the only Victor Asal in America, like seriously I am, you can find me online very easily.
I really appreciate it, Victor, and I will take you up on that and follow up. Look forward to talking more.
Great. But now Aiden can silence me forever.
I think we're going to wrap up with two more questions from our students. So the first one will be from El Said.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting discussions. My question is about the population, because the population is most important thing in statistics. So how you describe this population for QAnon, since how many female or male education level? Because I believe that how to transfer this anger to action level is correlated to the gender or the age or the education level. So how you describe the population?
It's a great question. I like that you're thinking about, again, this is helping think about, all sorts of things to account for. And so right now I don't have an empirical answer to that when it comes to talking about, I think you mentioned age, I think education, like just demographic type stuff, but all sorts of other things. So at this point, and in this early stage, I don't have those data to really that just involves more nuanced statistical tests to account for those things that I have not done yet. Kind of just really quickly, and I know we're short on time, Victor, it just occurred to me, and it's kind of related to this question. I didn't do work that accounted for a bunch of different things, but I'm thinking back to work that I contributed to, I think it was 2011 with Allison Smith and Conway and others, where we just compared terrorist groups to non-terrorist groups in geographically similar regions, same sort of ideology. So trying to account for some of those different factors. And you do see that violent but ideological similar groups are less complex, right, compared to comparable non-violent but ideological similar groups. And we looked at that in the context of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and others. So, and I do have a paper on that, happy to send that out. But again, lots of things that I need to account for, haven't done that yet.
All right. Sebastian?
Hey, Dr. Houck, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to apologize if my voice cuts out really quickly. My internet isn't all that great. But I had a question regarding, in light of yesterday's events with the failed kind of inauguration that has been seeing a lot of traction for QAnon, were there any plans to follow up on that with your research once more information comes out? Or I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but I'd be really interested to see like that following up.
Actually, if
Yeah.
you could provide some context to what he's talking about, because I didn't know about this until about 5 minutes ago. So
Sure. So as I understand it, that March 4th is was a significant date for QAnon and for others because it has some historical meaning of when a president is officially inaugurated in. Someone might have a better answer to that. But the overall takeaway is that some QAnon followers thought, well, actually, President Trump will be inaugurated on March 4th because historically that's what's happened in presidencies. That's my understanding of it. And of course, that didn't happen yesterday. I see someone posted in the chat something more specific. 20th Amendment passed in 1933. It changed the inauguration date from March 4th. Okay, got it. So that's the history behind that. And, you know, I think I don't want to get too hung up on specific predictions because QAnon has had countless predictions over their time. And so I think if there was an overall pattern in what happens to the way people think and maybe the way they behave, because really we're all interested in outcomes and behavior, you know, kind of pre and post failed predictions. I think that's interesting to me. Maybe there's something uniquely different about yesterday because some might say, well, that's going to be the final thing that closes the book on this for QAnon. I don't think it will. I think, you know, getting back to that idea of post hoc justification or, you know, kind of reducing dissonance by just finding different rationales or explanations for why, you know, that didn't occur. So it's a great question. It's great to be thinking about. I don't have plans to do that specifically at this time.
So Nika, we're going to give her a chance to speak. She's the last one. But before we do that and we wrap up, I do want to share with everybody, let's see if I can do this. Our speaker, our next speaker, we're actually going to have a little bit of a pause. And our next speaker, only one doctor, she's a super doctor, will be Dr. Gisela Bichler. She's at the Cal State University San Bernardino, and she's an expert in understanding criminal networks and gang violence. So I think that should be a very, very interesting talk. So I encourage you all to swing out for that. Again, that's Friday, March 26th. So we'll have a couple weeks until our next talk. But with that, I do want to end with one last question. And let me find Nika. We're going to unmute her to let her ask her question.
Hey, Professor. Sorry about a while ago. I wasn't able, I had to step away from my desk, but I am so interested in your natural language processing and sentiment analysis work because I'm doing it for my thesis as well. I was wondering what method or what model, did you use a BERT model and also what is your emotion lexicon that you used for your work?
So I don't know what the BERT model is. So I'm traditionally trained as a social psychologist and not in communication, and the natural language processing kind of mechanisms I focused on are really constrained to integrative complexity, rigidity versus, you know, flexibility, and then the Luke. And so I can't claim expertise on the model that you're talking about or even awareness of it. Love to hear more about it. Emotion lexicon, I'm not sure what you mean by that. But looking at the emotion, it's specifically emotion related words, and the Luke, LIW, has a dictionary associated with that category.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Because there's different types of dictionaries for emotions, and that's what an emotion lexicon is. So yeah, no, I was just curious, but I will look into your research and I can probably mine it from there. So thank you for such an interesting talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for all the questions, and the conversation doesn't need to stop here. Of course, please feel free to email me, and I'd love to talk more and also to get more feedback. It would be very helpful. Collaboration's always on the table.
All righty. With that, we are definitely out of time, and I want to thank Dr. Houck for graciously going over and answering everybody's questions. I know we did have one other question up, but Sean, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to Dr. Houck as you desire. We can get you contacted if you needed. In terms of the mailing list, there's an NCITE mailing list. So, and Yep. Or you can go to our webpage at seminar.findingthefanatic.com. This is actually a webpage that we manage for our class, where we're teaching students about machine learning and how to find the fanatic on Reddit social media data. And so an exciting part of our project is we'll actually be posting to this webpage Python tutorials on the material that we're teaching on natural language processing and graph theory and all sorts of fun stuff. So please keep an eye out at seminar.findingthefanatic.com. And we'll also post a link on the webpage. Hopefully we'll be able to post this video. So if you missed part of it or you want to share it more broadly so people can see Dr. Houck's great work, please do so. There will be a link on the YouTube. And again, thank you, everybody. And we'll catch you in a few weeks on March 26th.